Hello, listener. Manu here from Naavik. Before diving into today's awesome episode with Lars, Khaled, and Alex, I just wanted to briefly let you know about Polka Starter's Game Awards, and that's Game with a 3. As one of the first Web3 gaming award shows out there, I had the privilege of being a jury member for it, and I can already tell you that it's going to be quite an exciting one. The show airs on 15 December at 3 p.m. UTC, and there are 15 award categories, including the People's Choice Award, Most Anticipated Game, and of course, the coveted Game of the Year award. Plus, there will be various world premieres and unreleased gameplay announcements and trailers. On top of that, you too will have a chance to win some great prizes, including a gaming PC, a PS5, and much, much more. So make sure to tune into the live stream on 15 December, 3 p.m. UTC to check out who will walk away with the $1 million prize pool and the various winners, of course. Links are available in the show notes. With that, let's get on with the episode.
Greetings, friends. Welcome to another session of the Crypto Corner brought to you by Naavik. I'm your host, Alex Takei. And today we'll be talking about a very fun topic that's quite relevant to many Web3 games, and that's of land economies. Selling it, buying it, building it, extracting from it, and how to potentially build an economy around it. And what the fuck happens if you've got some speculators in the mix and sort of how they can potentially sabotage it. And so today I'm joined by Lars Doucet, author of Land and Why It Matters, and Khaled Alroumi, director of Monetization and Economy at Big Time Studios, and a previous game designer on Illuvium. Welcome to the Metacast, guys.
Great to be here.
Thank you very much. It's pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And so it's good to have you guys both on. I have definitely had a ton of friends that have stayed up into absurd hours of the night in the US to make sure they're primed and ready to buy the housing sale in Final Fantasy XIV. And last December, there was something absolutely crazy in terms of a land sale of like $4 million or something in Sandbox. And so we've talked ad nauseum about how speculative economies suck and Web3 equals Ponzi scheme, and land speculation certainly might fall into this category. And I've been super keen to talk about virtual land and figure out whether or not a virtual land economy, quote, works. But before we jump in, I would love to hear some intros from the both of you. And for fun, let's also add our favorite land before time dinosaur into our intros as an icebreaker. Khaled, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'm going to start with my favorite dinosaur from Land Before Time. So I don't really remember the name, but honestly, as a small kid, I watched this movie and I was really terrified from the T-Rexes. So I'm going to pick one of those. So let me tell you a bit about myself. So I've been working in games for around 10 years, mostly focusing on free-to-play games, mid-core titles on mobile, up until late of last year, where I joined Illuvium as a systems designer. I stayed there for 1 year, and now I am working with Big Time as a director of Economy and Monetization. And we just got to release our details about our economy just recently, 1 week ago, to be specific. So yeah, it's really interesting times to work on Web3.
Awesome. The T-Rexes.
Yeah, T-Rexes.
Yeah, I'm a huge Chomper fan. So it's Chomper or go home, for me at least. So I'm with you on the T-Rexes, but maybe he's a little bit different. He's like a baby T-Rex. So
yeah,
a cute T-Rex. Lars, how about you?
Okay, I think it would probably be Sarah. She's not. She's probably the least likable, but I do think that gives her the most potential for character growth. And also, I didn't realize the first time I watched it that. I thought her name was Sarah, Sarah, but it's actually Cera because she's a protoceratops, and I thought that was a nice touch. So
that is clever.
So I learned the most from that one. My background is that I originally got my degree in architecture a million years ago, and I then went into game design as my actual career. I never sat for the architect's exam, and I made some games on Steam, and I collaborated with a bunch of other people on their games, more on kind of the indie side of things. But then through my company, Level Up Labs, my co-founder worked for Congregate.com. And so, I absorbed a lot of free-to-play knowledge from my co-founder, who wrote some seminal papers on free-to-play monetization design. And over the course of events, we became consultants and advised on a lot of projects. And anyway, I started to kind of get a knack for economy and diving into the analysis of things. And this kind of culminated in this observation I had over the last kind of 30 years before Web3, before free to play, dating back to MMOs and even before MMOs into the roots of MUDs and mushes. Land speculation is actually really old in video games, and it's been a problem that's consistently been reproducing itself. So I did a series of interviews with designers of these games, economists that worked on EVE Online and Raf Koster, who's worked on Star Wars Galaxies and Ultima Online and all these other games, and just kind of like try to track down the roots of and patterns of these virtual housing crises. And then most recently, I wrote a book about the actual physical world economy. My book, Land is a Big Deal, just about the actual physical housing crisis and, some things we might be able to do about it. So that's kind of how I kind of got tied up in these sorts of conversation. Of course, for the last year, I've been working for Naavik, doing deconstructions of Web3 games. And so I applied that kind of background knowledge of virtual housing crises and analyzing games like Axie Infinity, the Sandbox, Decentraland, so on and so forth.
Awesome. Well, that's a perfect transition to, I guess, where I want to start, because the first thing I want to talk about is what is land and what role it plays in the real world. And so I've been so inundated recently by the Lensa AI, generative images, and people chatting with ChatGPT like all the time. And so I decided that in the theme of this week, I would also ask ChatGPT what land is, and ChatGPT crushed it, I gotta say. ChatGPT told me that land is a natural resource that refers to the solid surface of the earth. It includes both the surface of the ground as well as vegetation, structures, and other natural or man-made features that are present on the surface. Land is a valuable resource that is used for a variety of purposes, including agriculture, housing, and industry. So, hell yeah, ChatGPT, backbone of the real estate industry. I'm taking a real estate investment course next semester. So I'm ready to activate my inner REIT trading. And so I guess, like, Lars, first question to you. What do you think of ChatGPT's assessment? Is ChatGPT with it when it comes to the description of land?
Yeah, it's certainly an accurate description of natural land, right? But when we talk about economic land, we mean something a little bit more than just physical dirt, right? We generally mean is locations, right? And real estate agents kind of give it away, right? What are the three most important rules of real estate? Location, 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 right? And so you can have locations in places that don't feel like natural land. Like you can have locations in space, right? In orbital real estate, there's a fixed amount of satellites you can put into low Earth orbit before they start to collide with each other. There is a fixed amount of locations in certain possibility spaces. Like there's only so many 2-letter domain names using the 26 characters of the English alphabet, right? And those are all squatted by speculators, I will guarantee you. And so there's other kinds of land-like assets, we'll say. In terms of natural land, sometimes like non-renewable resource deposits like oil and gold are sometimes lumped under land. The difference is you can't, generally speaking, use up natural land, but you can use up depletable natural resources. But when we go into the virtual world, and the basis of my whole theory is that land, even in the virtual world, you can make your own rules, right? You can call things whatever you want. But just because you call something land in your video game doesn't necessarily mean it's a land-like asset. It's a land-like asset economically if it has 3 properties. And those 3 properties are that it's scarce, it's necessary for production, and it obtains value based off its location in some kind of geography, right? Whether that's a Euclidean geography like we have in the real world or some other kind of network, right? And so the stronger those 3 features are, basically my thesis is the more it attracts speculation. And the weaker any of those 3 properties is, the less speculation it has. For instance, Decentraland has perfect point-to-point teleportation. And this decreases the locational value of any given property. But other places where you have weaker teleportation and you have to traverse land, that increases the locational value, or the kind of funneling, like you'd rather be right next to someone because it doesn't take you 3 hours to traverse the map, sort of deal. Anyway, that's kind of my thesis about the difference between economic land and natural land. Natural land is a kind of economic land, but there are other kinds.
Got it. So ChatGPT crushed it on the natural land but did not mention. I'll ask it next, actually, after this podcast is over, what he thinks about economic land.
Yeah.
And so I guess it sounds like what I'm pulling from you is that there's a couple of components of land that I should be looking at to assess its like goodness, right? One is location. Two might be like the natural ores that are present inside the land, the resources that I can extract from it, right? Potentially the improvements that have been built upon it, where that could be a house or a farm, and things like that, right? And so you have this kind of like, in the real world, there are certain rules and structures that govern and regulate land, right? And I was wondering whether or not maybe you could share some of those before we kind of jump into talking about the differences between land that's designed in the virtual world, which Khaled can probably share a little bit more about, but sort of like in IRL, right? Like what are some of the big financial rules and regulations that govern actual land that then could potentially be relevant for virtual land, but let's keeping this in the physical territory first.
Right. So if we start with one of the biggest ones is zoning regulations, right? So one thing to keep in mind in the real world, mineral rights, although naturally they're part of the land, are often sold separately in the United States, at least. When you buy a house, the mineral rights have probably already been separately sold. So you don't necessarily, like if there's oil underneath your house, someone might have free reign to come and pump it without compensating you because they already own the mineral rights. So that's something to look out for. Then there's the air rights, like your right to build upwards, right, into three-dimensional space. And zoning is a big restriction on this in a lot of places. Like, have you ever wondered why skyscrapers in the US aren't just like straight up? Why they have this like tapered kind of approach as they go up? That's actually them building out to the legal envelope of the zoning. Like there's this rule for like, you go up this far, then you got to set back. Then you got to set back again. And so any buildings that are going straight up vertically, usually you'll notice they're not using most of their plot because these air rights can kind of be traded. And so a lot of our built environment is directly influenced by the regulatory zoning restrictions that we have. And I could go into a whole detail of it, but I would just recommend people read Arbitrary Lines by M. Nolan Gray. He's a city planner. He's talked about this whole history of where American zoning came from. And the basic thesis is that it's generally bad and restricts the supply of our housing and directly contributes to the housing crisis. But in the real world, like what you are allowed to do with land massively influences its value, right? And so you can see this, for example, with people holding on to what look like very low value plots, but then they're lobbying the city to upzone them. And the minute it gets upzoned, the price magically goes up, right? Right. And then they sell it off and they obtain a windfall profit.
Sure. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think like, yep, in the way that I'm seeing that mapping now to our, discussion about land in the virtual world is that like, that's what a game designer would choose, what rules there are that are set in that land. And so maybe let's like shift to that a little bit, right? We could probably spend multiple hours talking about real world land. It's obviously a very deep topic and very prevalent, and lots of people have done a plethora of academic studies, and obviously there's the real world economy that rotates around land's biggest asset class. But this is a gaming podcast, so how land is manifesting itself in the digital world. I pulled a little clip from Sandbox, which is our favorite Web3 land, I guess, or a notorious Web3 land economy, right? And it says, land is a digital piece of real estate in the Sandbox's metaverse. Game designers use land to build digital experiences such as games or dioramas, and also populate it with assets. Multiple lands can be combined to form an estate, and a special estate that's owned by more than one person is called a district. And so a variety of other games like Illuvium, Crypto Unicorns, and whatever other side will become also use land as the cornerstone of their game design as either a semi-variable soft token or an NFT. And so Khaled, maybe you can sort of jump in here from your experience at Illuvium and Big Time. What are the ways you are thinking about using land to create a player experience and secondarily drive an economy?
Yeah, sure. So let me tell you just first, not from a standpoint of me being part of any company, like me as a system designer, like as my personal opinion is how we would utilize virtual lands. This is the way I would look at it, as we have basically a virtual good that is limited in supply that may have certain functions in a game. And we would cover it or use the land cover on it because that's how we could easily convey to the users that this is something that is scarce and this is something that you could potentially get some value from. So we don't look at it as really as a land. Land is just a way to convey the message easily. Like that's how I look at it from a pure systematic point of view.
And so I guess in that regard, right, what controls have you installed centrally to control this, I guess, finite asset or digital virtual good?
Yeah, sure. So I could give you just 2 examples. So in the case of Illuvium, where the land is actually not the main part of the gameplay. So Illuvium, the land in Illuvium is just like a small part of the gameplay, where it's there for a specific type of players who are looking to benefit or get some value from the game if it became very popular. Okay, but the actual game is played outside the land and it's not required by most of the players. So in this case, land being scarce does not harm the user experience at all. However, if you take a game that is the more land you have, the more experiences you have for the user, here is where if you implement scarcity, you might really affect the end user experience, and it could end up harming the game. So, virtual land is not like treated across the board 100% the same. It really depends on the actual rules that you put in, or the game design, or the systems that are set in place, and how the player will interact with these systems.
Got it. And so if let's just say the land is maybe a main or central part of the game, or it's not, right? Let's just maybe take, in Illuvium, it sounds like it's kind of like a side agenda, right? But in some games, it's actually like a very, very big deal, such that if you didn't have a plot of land, you wouldn't be able to build anything at all, right? The land is the cornerstone of the actual game itself. And so if you, from the system designer perspective, and maybe obviously Lars, feel free to jump in, how would I think about having a finite amount of plots of land or having a infinitely expandable surface, right? Because unlike the real world, I can just print more land. And but you just told me that the speculation and the finiteness is what makes it valuable. So how do I kind of, as a game designer, how should I think about that?
The way you look at it is it depends on the systems that are set in place. Like, again, we shouldn't look at it as, is this a land or not a land? We should look at it as, this system behaves in such way. Does it benefit the ecosystem if it's finite or not finite? Like, that's basically what I wanted to say. So Lars, you could go ahead.
Right. I agree. So my understanding of Illuvium is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that land can help you generate fuel, but you can get fuel in other ways. It's not like only the landowners create this resource. And so when I talked about my 3 rules, right? Scarce in supply, necessary for production, and obtains value from location. So the fact that you can get whatever resource or whatever benefit Illuvium land generates from somewhere else makes it less necessary for production, right? And so this makes it a much weaker land-like asset. And so as he's saying, land is used mostly as a theme, right? And so this reduces the speculative value of Illuvium land, if my understanding is correct. And the basic point there is that in the real world, everything you do requires land. Like I say, you can't eat, sleep, work, or poop without access to a location to do those things. And in video games, we can create different rules, right? You can opt out of necessarily, like you can either have common land to do any of the things you need to do, and then land that's owned only provides like it provides some kind of special benefit. Like in most of the traditional MMOs, the virtual housing crises didn't destroy those games. Like Ultima Online's still going on like 20, 25, how old am I, 30? I don't know. Like 25 years later, it feels like, Ultima Online's still going on, and it still has a housing crisis, but the game isn't broken because housing's only one sector of the game. It's not fundamental to the game. And so the more necessary you make the land to do anything in the game, for any progression, the more it gatekeeps, the more all those benefits accrue to the people who have access to this thing that everybody needs. But if it only provides a benefit and land is mostly used as a theme, you don't even necessarily have a problem or a huge problem, right? And so that's kind of why I like to think of, and I agree with Khaled, that it's not so much land or not land. It's like in my policy paper about land in virtual worlds, I describe it as a sliding scale, right? Of how landy the land is in economic terms. And when it's more, when it's weaker, you have less problems. Like in my deconstruction of Decentraland for Naavik, I talked about how Decentraland seems like it has really classic land parcels, but because of the teleportation and other aspects, the locational values decreased a lot. And that makes it so that you saw more speculation in the Sandbox and Axie Infinity based off of the expectations they had set forth than you did in Decentraland. And so those observations have held consistent, at least in the things I've looked at. But, I'd be more than welcome to hear people who found things that kind of break my expectations. But so far, I don't see enormous concerns with Illuvium's land as designed based on my understanding of it.
Got it. And I guess is the goal to 100% reduce that speculation, right? Are you saying that would be potentially damaging? Let's just say you had a land economy that kind of rotates. It's finite asset class. It's like you can definitely get around and get by without having land. And so is it really that big of a deal that there is land speculation at all in your game?
Right. Well, I mean, if you want to make a game where the theme is like cutthroat real estate, land grabs, maybe some people think that's fun, but you should just be upfront about that, right? And so like my point is that a lot of people don't realize the kind of dynamics you're in for. They imagine a world where it's like, oh, people buy land and then they build stuff on it and they build up this community and like everybody wins. But in practice, what happens is that when land becomes when truly land-like assets, like the strongest ones where all three principles hold, they become an investment for essentially absentee landlords who lease them out to the actual builders and extract value from the builders. And so the thing is, a lot of these classic worlds like the Sandbox and Axie Infinity's land as it was pitched and Yuga Labs' thing as it was pitched is they really want to be UGC platforms, user-generated content platforms like Roblox and or Minecraft or Fortnite or whatever, or VR chat. And they're not set up in a way that actually rewards building. It doesn't allocate the land to the most creative people. It allocates land to whoever got there first. And then that person just passively collects rent from the actual builders who come in later. And I don't think that's a good recipe for building a successful user-generated content platform. You notice land in Roblox is free. And so, I mean, if you want to use a scarce asset that has a physical location on the map somewhere as part of your mix, I don't think that's necessarily a problem. But if you make it the very centerpiece of everything your project is about, and then pitch it based off of this flurry of creativity that's going to come, just empirically, we haven't seen that succeed.
And so let's talk about the rent thing. I pulled rent out of there pretty quickly. If I were to build a land economy, right? Let's talk a little bit about from the perspective of the developer, right? How do I make money from my land, right? IRL, I see taxes and rent, and those are like the two main ways. You can have a short-term lease, a long-term lease. You could pay taxes on the land. You can pay taxes on the improvements. Should people be paying? And so I guess maybe from the developer side at Illuvium, like how did you sell the land? Did you sell it as one piece and then there was nothing kind of attached to it? Or was there actually like imbued financial economic levers over time to control potentially maybe some of the things that Lars is talking about in terms of making sure it's not getting hogged by an investor who's just squatting on the land, for example?
Yeah, so I actually could tell you from 2 points of view. So from Illuvium point of view and from Big Time point of view. So in Big Time, we also have our equivalent of land, which are spaces. So in Illuvium, the main purpose or the economic value that you could get from land is producing fuel. And fuel, you could sell it in liquidity pools and whatnot, and that's how you make your money. However, in Big Time, once you have a space, now you're able to craft cosmetic NFTs, and that's how you get your value from it, basically. You craft cosmetic NFTs and you sell it to end users who don't have spaces, who want these cosmetic NFTs. And actually renting is a mechanic that is, like I would say that almost most of the time that we want to put it in because we would have a class of users who don't want to play the game or who don't have time to play the game, or either they have tons of these lands and they cannot physically manage all of these lands. So instead of them hoarding everything and just sitting, not doing anything in our game, getting harmed from that, we need to integrate a system where it would benefit us, where these NFTs or lands are actually getting utilized. And at the same time, they are rewarding whoever is holding to all of these lands. So renting is there just to solve this problem of speculator buying things, hoarding them, and not even enabling the economy with them. So it becomes like a must to avoid these situations where someone hoarding everything and not enabling the economy.
Right. Got it. That actually dovetails with the recommendation I make in my policy paper that the government, in this case, the developer, lease out your land on short-term leases at market rates. Right. And that tends to solve the speculative problem. Like if you absolutely have to have scarce locational based resources that, gatekeep some feature, just lease them out at market rates. And that way, that tends to allocate things most efficiently. That's what we see in the real world economies. And there's been some experiments in some games to kind of allocate things on this basis. That way, the person who wants it the most and has an idea of something productive to do with it will hold on to it. But someone who's just like, I want to hold abc.com for 30 years until someone pays me $10 million will not want to pay, $2,000 a year or whatever to hold on to such a valuable URL, right? Another proposal that's been put out from the crypto world is Vitalik Buterin. He wrote a proposal for bid-based domain value allocations for the Ethereum name service. And he talked about how these kinds of virtual land, right, that obtain value, in this space, it's not exactly like a leasing system, but it's similar to it, where it's able to, get signals from the market. And so like the holding cost increases as there's more demand for the thing. So that someone who's holding it just to wait for someone else just gives it up. Right. And then it gets put to use. And then that can actually bring prices down in the long run, because it's not just scalpers driving the price up. It's based off of actual use, which also helps you get less of a frothy price, and so like you can have like a saner price that represents what people are actually valuing your project for, to actually use the project, and actually generate value. And then again, what he talks about is like cosmetics. Cosmetics are a wonderful monetization thing in a lot of these games, because they're not necessarily gatekeeping access to the game itself, but they're a very socially important aspect of free-to-play monetization. It's like I can play Fall Guys and look like a noob wearing nothing but the free costumes all the time and still be the best player in the game. But if I want to look cool, then I might want to drop $100, right? And so I think there's some fair ways to do this that don't, because one of the problems is you do not want to cut off access to your own growth. You don't want to keep your own users out just because you want to reward the first 50 people to jump on some assets early on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so in that, right, I heard about basically a supply demand kind of pricing orientation, right? We talked about leases. If I wanted to lease and execute a short-term lease or a long-term lease to someone to make sure that they aren't holding onto the land, right? We just talked about, I wouldn't want to hold the domain name abc.com or abc.url because I wouldn't want to incur the cost that it takes that accumulate over the 30 years. How do I know how much to charge for a short-term lease in my land economy, right? Like actually, what's the mathematical equation that I set up to actually determine that? And, Khaled, you talked a lot about that role specking, right? Like in Web3 games, that is one of the biggest ways people are trying to solve the nature of the speculative economy, to basically like offset and say like, hey, the speculators will be over here. These are the farmers. These are the players. And then everything will kind of balance out, versus the Axie problem, which was like everybody wants to be an earner. And if you have this diverse role case, you actually maybe balance and set out the economy, because some people's gains and losses are offset in different places. But, so it sounds like you guys are actually implementing a lease. But how do I know how much to pay or charge?
Yeah. So for us, actually, it's very, very complex. Like I'm talking about big time compared to Illuvium. Illuvium, it was almost like a straightforward equation. You could know exactly what is the output. You can forecast prices, and then you could set something up. But in big time, it's a bit different, because once you have a space, now you can start crafting cosmetics, and it's like not a linear process. There are multiple recipes. There is multiple ways that you could be lucky or unlucky and things like that. So it's very hard to predict. We're honestly depending on the market to figure this out, honestly. It's very hard to put an equation or to solve it via an equation. I think there will be some price discovery. We're also, to add more complexity to it, we're actually allowing you to package, or like this is what we're thinking about doing. So we're thinking about packaging multiple NFTs together. So I could have a space, and then I could add some decorations to it, and I could have some little factories there, and I would rent it out. So also, if you want to put your own touch to it, make it look nicer, give it a theme, you could also do that. So price discovery via the market, I think is where we're looking to do. Honestly, it's very hard to put a number on that.
Well, that's actually what I recommend, actually. So it's like the beauty of leases. In the real world, I generally recommend a land value tax, which is a tax that is a tax on the ground rent of land, but excludes the value of buildings. And this is just a practical compromise with the way the real world is. In a world where you're the government and you create everything, you can just do short-term leases. And the reason that's advantageous in the digital world is that if there's any improvements, if someone, loses the next lease, you just stick the improvements in their pocket and move them anywhere. You can't move a house in real life. And the other thing with leases is just the correct price for the short-term lease is whatever the market will bear, right? Generally, the mechanism to discover this that I recommend is what's called a Vickrey auction. And this is different from a normal auction where basically you have an auction and everyone said it's silent, it's sealed. No one can see anyone else's bid. And then the highest bidder wins, but they pay the second highest bidded price. And there's a reason behind this. Basically, it makes it so that you don't have to game the system. Most auctions are designed to actually artificially inflate the price as high as possible. But a Vickrey auction is designed to get the highest price someone's actually rationally willing to pay. And because you're trying to do price discovery rather than just to juice, the sale of your random antique. And so I generally recommend market-based leases using a Vickrey auction method. And then, you just have your short-term leases and the market will tell you what the value of this particular location is worth. And then if you're trying to do the whole play to earn thing, what you can do is in real life, we have this, policy called a citizen's dividend or universal basic income. What you can do is that rather than the rents being captured by private actors who got there first, you can capture those as the government. And then in real life, you would use this fund schools and whatever. Or you could give it away as a dividend to your citizens. In a video game, it's your little virtual dollars are not going to help you pay your employees necessarily, unless they're cryptocurrency. So you could use that as some income for yourself, but you could additionally distribute at least some portion of that to your most engaged players as kind of a way to do play to earn sustainably. Basically, it's you guys all collectively created this entire economy to be valuable. So you have to pay rent. So people who really, really want to access the most high value locations will basically pay rent to the government for that privilege, and that will reduce speculation, ensure it gets allocated efficiently. And then we can reallocate that money, or at least a portion of it, to people who are making the ecosystem more valuable. The trick then is Sybil attacks and people signing up just to get a free lunch. But that is a challenge you're facing anyway, right? And I would probably do that more modestly, but rather trying to I'm not necessarily a fan of play to earn in general, but if you're going to do it, it makes more sense to do it on that model than to just give all of the rents straight to the 10 people who bought all the land first, because it will tend to also concentrate in fewer and fewer hands over time. And this is a way to make sure it's more widely distributed and more effective. So basically, the bottom line is I agree with Khaled that you want the market to figure it out, because otherwise you're trying to. Yeah, you'll have weird distortions and you'll just create a lot of work for yourself.
Sure. And if the market's supposed to figure it out, right? We love the idea that fair prices are set by open and equal markets. Am I a developer, right? And I need to build a land economy and I'm staffing up positions to actually determine what the fair price is. Sort of who should I be having on my central systems design and economic team in order to design a system that figures it out? Are we relying on mostly open source tools and such that, we see that this, that on OpenSea, this plot of land is trading at XYZ, and whether or not are there any kind of installation metrics that I should be putting in my game to make sure that the asset values don't ever go above a certain amount because of any reason, right? The 4 million plot of land seems, potentially exorbitant, but it sounds like there's a buyer that's out there that's willing to pay that. But I think are there ways that you can install price and floor ceilings? Maybe talk about your experiences kind of managing that land economy.
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the things that is an added layer of complexity because of Web3. So in free-to-play, we used to care about retention and monetization, and that's it. Here, we need to care about retention, monetization, and maintaining the prices of all our NFT assets. It's not something necessary, but it's something to maintain the goodwill between you and the initial buyers of your NFTs. It's funny that you said this, because we actually are working on a system similar to that, which is in big time we have a token that we're going to create that is called time. And to generate it, you need to have an hourglass. And once you have an hourglass, you can play the game and start generating time token. So a system that we implemented there is that once you play with the hourglass, it will be depleted. Now you need to recharge it. To recharge it, you need to pay premium currency. So once you pay the premium currency, which is bought from us, now you can start generating tokens. So we introduced an element that should add some stability somewhat and would act as a soft floor to the token. So whenever the token price goes down below the recharge cost, then theoretically it does make sense for me to recharge the hourglass. Suddenly what happens is that the supply of time token should decrease and the price should go up. And now it makes sense for me to recharge it and start farming it again. So we're trying to look at systems like this to add some stability to certain elements of the economy, and these would act as our levers going forward. So yeah, like these are the type of system. This is where we're thinking in terms of controlling these prices.
Yeah, and just to jump in, like that $4 million price in Sandbox was not an accident. Like it might have taken them by surprise that it went that high, but they were very intentionally trying to drive prices up like that. And they typically do that through setting very clear expectations. Like there will never be more than this, that you should buy these if you want to get rich, because you are going to be able to extract value from the builders who are to come, and this is going to be a big deal, and you're going to be next to Snoop Dogg, and a bunch of people are going to want to visit him and all of that. And we've intentionally gimped teleportation so that they're going to have to travel across your plot of land. And what you see happen after they've made all those promises is in reality sets in, nobody's really showing up, and then they start doing what I call land dilution, where they start going back on every promise except scarcity and hope people don't notice too much. Things like, okay, land will still be scarce, but we'll let some other people get resources this other way. Or, oh, we'll add a little bit more transportation, teleportation, and other things to basically like paint themselves out of the corner they painted themselves in, while still promising the scarcity thing, which is what everyone like focuses on. And what's happened with Axie and some of these other games is like, as soon as they do that and announce these changes, they get a landowner revolt, because it's like, hey, I paid $4 million for this under these expectations, and now you're changing the system. Of course they're upset. Right. And so I think it's very good with like, you can have whatever system you want to kind of put dampening effects in. And so like what Khaled is talking about here with the hourglasses and stuff is it's essentially, you know, like whatever land is gatekeeping, if there's some other way to do it and there's some like kind of like baseline level of it, you know, that's always going to like serve as a soft price floor for your asset. And so the thing to keep in mind is that to make sure that whatever changes you have like that, you tell people about that very clearly up front. Because what Sandbox was doing was very intentionally trying to drive the price up. And you sometimes see this in the real world where pundits can't decide if high or low home prices is a good thing or a bad thing. They're like, well, the housing market is cooling off, which is bad news because now house prices are going down. And people who have high home values, you know, but then maybe some people will be able to afford a house. Is that good, Stan? I can't decide, you know, or like the housing market is zooming. It's so good. All the prices are super high. You know, nobody will ever be able to afford to move out of their parents' basement. You know, aren't we glad? So like, I think, you know, a lot of these things are set by the expectations of the asset. That's why you're able to sell $4 million worth of land before the land can really do anything. And so I think like with the various measures Khaled is talking about, you know, in their case, they're making it very clear what all these mechanisms are going to be up front. Or, I mean, I haven't read the whole paper, but I'm, you know, going on good faith that it's all there, you know? And so like the expectations drive prices. Like the minute you announce a change to your system, you'll see the prices move even before you even implement them.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just like announcing earnings or potential earnings or an AOP or an annual operating plan. And it sounds like the same thing. It's just with feature changes, maybe in the game itself, you know, changing the timing on the hourglass or changing how much of time it takes to fill it up. Right. But I guess maybe like sort of, it sounds like there's a lot of things, there's a lot of like do's and don'ts I'm pulling out of this conversation, right? Like potentially don't have your land be finite. And if it is finite, you have to give people a way to access the gameplay benefits that would come from the finite land some other way, right? Don't try and change the rules of your land like 24/7 and don't take back sort of like what you promised to your consumers. what are some of like the big land projects that we've seen so far, right? Decentraland, Sandbox, Illuvium, Crypto Unicorns. I think it's more of a farming and resource gathering rather than like a real estate project. But again, like there's a lot of depth to these economies, and it's obviously all hard to keep track of. What are some of the big like mistakes that some of these companies have made in your guys' opinion? And how can a new developer that is building a land economy learn from those moving forward?
Yes, I could just tell you something that is one of the most obvious points, which is to play the game, you need to have a land. I mean, this is something that we've seen very, very common, and it's one of the most devastating things that a developer could do to their game, assuming they want to grow their user base. Beside that, like generally for Web3 games, is also trying to build the game and assuming that your entire audience is going to come from Web3 native players who are expecting to make money out of the ecosystem, and then it ends up being everyone who puts $1 in is expecting to get $2 back. And that's from the get-go is like, it's not sustainable. I think going forward, hopefully we're going to see games where would attract regular type of players or who are in it to get the experience, so not only just to make money. And I think the way we should look at it is how could we +1 the experience from the current free-to-play games? We shouldn't come and try to make something that is revolutionary. I mean, it could work, but I think it's a long shot. I think we should look at the current free-to-play games and how could we +1 that experience for the player. And that's the key, and that should be our guideline going forward for any decision that we're trying to do in games or in Web3 games or any in that regard, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Khaled. And then another thing I would add is also a major problem a lot of Web3 games come from is, Khaled has this background in traditional game design. A lot of other companies, they don't have a Khaled on staff. They didn't actually hire a lot of game designers. They hired a lot of people from finance who wrote a white paper and then, kind of barreled down the wall. And so one thing I've noticed a lot is a lot of like, one of the challenges with Web3 game design is that you cast all these design decisions in concrete early on. And anyone who spent any time in game development knows how drastically your final game can look from your first shipped version. You need to make changes in response to players. But the problem is when you've cast them in concrete, first on the blockchain and then in the financial expectations of your initial players/investors, then it becomes very difficult to pivot to a project without breaking the project immediately and causing it to fail, right? And so I think being like, don't make a million promises up front. People make those promises because then they can make a lot of money off of a pre-sale, right? And so I would be very cautious about that. And one more thing I would like to just like kind of zoom into real quick is the notion of scarcity is actually really more complicated than people realize when it comes to locations, right? Because like there's this big notion in video games. It's like, well, we're not confined to the virtual world, to the laws of physics. Why can't we just print more land for everything? And so one of the things that's really interesting is that Ultima Online has essentially infinite land. So how can it still have a housing crisis 25 years later? Well, it's because of what we call urban agglomeration effects. And what all this means is that you want to hang out with your friends, right? Sure. You don't want to hang out in the middle of the Nevada desert. You want to be in New York City, or if New York City is not your style, maybe a small town, but like a small town where all your friends are, right? And so the most popular server is always going to be the one with the biggest housing crisis. And when people are like, well, why don't you just play on the least populated server? The answer is going to be because it's boring and it's no fun because there's no players there. And so I have no demand to be there. So even if you have infinite, land, the point is that locations are non-fungible. And that's what we mean when land is scarce. So even if you're printing infinite land, if all land does is gatekeep access to a resource, then land is fungible. But if land gatekeeps access to, say, social experiences, which is what happens when you model like towns and cities, then land is non-fungible and it gatekeeps access to your friends, to other people, to thriving markets and dungeon opportunities and stuff, right? And that is one thing that you should be really careful about is like Raf Costa was telling me that in Star Wars Galaxies, you had phenomena where people could build like player built cities. and people would build them on top of dungeons in order to basically put a toll booth around the dungeon. The dungeon was like public land, but now like people would like gatekeep it and stuff like that. And so that's just another thing to watch out for is that locations are non-fungible.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I was about to say, have there been any land economies that are maybe not, we talked about this role of the government, the game designer or the game developer centrally controlling and maybe taxing whichever way, or setting a short-term lease by a victory auction, et cetera. But have there been any economies or maybe what do you guys think about this in the sense that maybe people kind of just attack one another and take over the land and set their own rules, right? So kind of doing what you had just said in Star Wars Galaxy, where they're like, okay, me and my group of clan friends have decided that this dungeon is very valuable to us. So therefore we have built a city around it with walls. And now we will charge a toll to anybody that would like to run this dungeon.
Right.
And we as a faction, a clan, will make, and potentially in a Web3 environment, an actual token that's of real world value to them for doing those types of things. What is your kind of initial reaction to that? Does that make the game fun? Does that make the game too realistic to be fun? I guess I don't know. That's popped into my mind, right?
I talk about that kind of allocation system called blood taxes. And this is how animals allocate land in the natural world. The difference between that and the standard system is in the standard system, the government has a monopoly on violence. So you can buy land and then the police will come and chase someone off if they try to take your land. But in the natural world, it's just nature red in tooth and claw. It's just you, right? And it's brutal and it's scary and it's EVE Online. It's the modern incarnation of EVE Online in null-sec regions, null security regions. This is how turf is allocated. And it's brutal. It's just endless gang wars. Some people find that endlessly fun, but it does have a kind of brutal efficiency allocation. There's in a total perfect blood taxes system, basically like land is allocated by spending blood. And there's no security, there's no safety, but there's a lot of efficiency, right? Because if you're a fearsome creature, you're going to go after the best land that you can credibly defend, right? And you're going to very quickly naturally find your niche. You're not going to seek out land that is really, really valuable, but is so valuable that it will attract monsters scarier than you. So you will find the most valuable hill that is not worth attacking for more scary monsters because they're going to go after an even more valuable place. So you'll find your niche in the ecosystem. You will never get a moment's sleep. You will be terrified for your entire existence, but efficiency will quickly arise. And Reddit/r/place, if you've played that little mini game, I'll describe it for the audience. It started as an April Fool's joke. And it's a Reddit mini game where people there's this big mural, it's made out of pixels, and every Reddit user every 5 minutes can place one pixel in like 12 colors. That's it. That's the only rule. And this is very much like blood taxes, although here it's attention. And so people make all these huge murals. It's not like you claim a bunch of land and it's yours, and the government of Reddit enforces that and you can do whatever, because then you would get a very boring mural very quickly. Instead, anyone can graffiti anything as long as they're willing to place their pixel every 5 minutes. And so you had all kinds of weird emergent behavior arise. And it was, first of all, it was kind of like stressful. You had to have nothing else you were doing that weekend. But you had things like, okay, me and my group are over here and we're trying to like paint our little mural. And then, the Swedish flag is marching towards us. And so it's like, it's taking over our little buffer state. Of like, so there was, I think there was like a pride flag like next to us, and the Swedes were like encroaching on it, not ideologically, just because Sweden eats everything. And so like people from our group were like rebuilding the pride flag because it's like, if they go down, we're next. We need to protect our buffer state. Oh, they got eliminated. Okay, we can reallocate some land here as like a refugee state. And then like we've got our own allies. The neoliberals are beneath us. They're helping us. But then like we want to like write our little slogan in a higher font. And we're coordinating in our Discord channel, but we're getting friendly fire from somewhere that erases it to the old version. So we're like, oh, are our allies like not realizing we changed what we're trying to build? We send diplomats to their Discord. They're like, no, that's not coming from us. And so you can check each pixel and see who's drawing it. It's coming from the furries. We're like, we don't even have diplomatic relations with the furries. And we talk to them. And it's like, what are you guys doing? You're giving us friendly fire. We're trying to do this now. They're like, oh, that's cool. They're like, what are you even doing here? They're like, well, we have to defend you or the Swedish will eat us next. And all of those rules, all of those interactions are totally emergent that just come from any Reddit user can place one pixel every 5 minutes, right? And it's incredibly stressful and it's not a game for everyone. But that is a system I call blood taxes, where you just allocate land by combat and it goes to whoever is able to credibly defend that territory. And that's how Eve allocates space in nullsec zones.
Sure. Yeah, I'm also just picturing myself in Civ, like going after that military victory. I'm oh yeah, I'm gonna get my city states. I'm gonna send my diplomat to the city state, and then the city state and I will raise Prussia to the ground, like, and then we'll burn all the farms and we'll pillage and we'll destroy all the buildings, and then we'll rebuild. Which is just it's an interesting.
There's a lot of negative externalities to that system, right? There's a lot of like, it's like incredibly allocates land to like the optimal fiercest monster for each hill, but it also, there's a lot of casualties left on the ground.
Sure. Yeah, potentially not it's not a game for the faint of heart, right? But it is a game that potentially could revolve around land as territory being that center pin, and being the thing that is, in reality, really oriented the centerpiece of the progression loop, and having people really vie for it because they get some sort of like extreme benefit, whether or not that's from experience, resources, just even simply cachet. Like, I live in the best house, which I'm sure is incredibly important to people. It's important to people in Final Fantasy XIV, so it would assume that it's important to lots of others. And I guess maybe one final question as we're coming up to time, right? If there were an economy right now that you think would benefit from installing a land-based economy as well, and I think the other idea is that like land as an economy is just another source of potential revenue, right? And in the Web3 environment, where you're actually giving up a lot of value to your players, and versus controlling it centrally, having a diversified asset class could actually be like quite helpful. What games do you think could benefit from having land economies that are either Web3 or Web2 right now, and kind of why?
So I'm going to actually like kind of twist the question and say that a lot of games wind up with land economies even if they don't intend to. And that's because, as I said, locations are non-fungible. So if you have a game that has some sense of location, and there's some value in controlling a location, even if you didn't intend for locations to be like owned, they can still be controlled, right? You know what I mean? And so like in the real world, you have this phenomenon of like public national parks that private landowners have bought up all the land around it, and you're not allowed to trespass on their land. So now they basically own the national park. And you have weird things like people like stepping over the corner of a parcel so they never step foot in the private land, and there's a whole dispute. And you see these kind of things happening in games like in Star Wars Galaxies, where there was no sense of land ownership, but like you could put down like a player-built city, and then people would gatekeep. It's like, it's my dungeon now, you got to pay a toll, right? And some games that I think could benefit from this, it's more like you could benefit from recognizing that you already have this system in your game, even if you didn't intend to. Like, and so an example is like any game where you have, and so like rather than like point out a specific one, I would say like most MMOs are going to have hidden land economies in them, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah, like the server dynamic, like WoW servers, right? Like Tichondrius or Area 4052, right?
And the ways you're able to exert control, soft or hard, over certain locations, right? You know, through your organizations, your guilds, your sort of things. Like, you know, something as simple as like basically my guild is always hunting in here and the monsters spawn at this rate. So if you want access to the monsters, you effectively have to be part of our guild. You know what I mean? We've essentially asserted control over that, like that little hunting zone.
I could tell you that, you know, essentially the Web2 games that used land very good in terms of, you know, systems and game design are 4X games, specifically the ones on mobile, like Game of War, Rise of Kingdoms, things like that. They utilize land very good. Like there is, sense of discovery. There is some tangible benefits to a specific place on the map. And if I were to say what would be a good experiment on land using like that type of gameplay, I would love to see Escape from Tarkov utilizing some persistency with land. I think that could either turn out to be amazing or extremely bad. But I would really want to see that and how it works out.
Interesting. So you mean like when you dive and those specific plots being places that you then own and control or fight for territory over? Is that how you're kind of seeing it?
What happened now in Escape from Tarkov is that you would queue up, and then they would drop you in a lobby, and then you know exactly what this lobby is. It's like a predefined map that is small, and then you go there, and then you extract, and you go back to your headquarters. So what happens if you merge your headquarters towards the map, and then there is always a sense of discovery. There's always risk factor going on. It would need a lot of stuff to polish out the experience, to make sure the rough edges are polished, whatnot. But I think there is some areas there to explore.
Yeah.
Awesome.
There was a series of private Minecraft servers that I forget exactly what they're called, but they were very heavily modded, economics oriented Minecraft servers, and the maintainers got in touch with me after I started writing these things, and they said it'd be really interesting to put some of these ideas to use, because we didn't realize that we had this locational based economy, right? We had land speculators, we had land barons who would exclude people from land and basically extract value from the actual laborers who were playing the game. And so it would be interesting to kind of go, if we were to do it again, go back in and recognize this problem, and then do a 2.0 version to kind of solve it. I never followed up and found out if they ever did it, but it sounded interesting to me.
Fascinating. Well, thank you guys for hopping on today, and thank you guys for your kind of bold and crazy predictions about which games would benefit from land economies. I know that I've learned a lot throughout this entire discussion about we never talked about the concept of Georgism, but essentially the taxes thing.
Land value
taxes,
tax
great auctions, land value taxes, speculation, scarcity, kind of what's the best way to sort of think about and model and have a land economy is rotating adjacent to maybe another main economy. So thank you guys for your insights. There was a lot to talk about. And thank you to our listeners. We'll be back next week. But until next time, friends, feel free to hit me up at alexandra@naavik.co. If you ever have any questions, comments, or dare say concerns. For Khaled and Lars, if people want to reach out to you, how can they get in touch?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at LarsCS Prime, and my book's at landisabigdeal.com.
Yeah, so for me, you can hit me up on Twitter. It's Alroumi _ and I'm also available on LinkedIn, Khaled Alroumi.
Amazing. All right. With that, we are out, and see you guys next time.